Okay. Welcome, everyone. Pleased to join you. Some people are still joining, but it is past 5, so let us start. We are very pleased to host this webinar on assessing the state of terrorism studies with such a distinguished panel joining us today. But in truth, this webinar is not just to assess the state of terrorism studies, but it was also timed to coincide with the launch of the new issue of the journal Perspectives on Terrorism, as we're particularly thrilled to announce publicly, as some of you might have already heard or read, that Perspectives on Terrorism is now being published by ICCT, the International Center for Counter-Terrorism, in partnership with the Institute of Security and Global Affairs at Leiden University and the Handa Center for the Study of Terrorism and Political Violence, known as CSTPV, at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. This has been a long-term, I should say, and collective effort. I still remember when I started discussing this idea, talking about the future of Perspectives on Terrorism with Alex Schmidt, who I'm very glad is joining us today, about a year ago. And I have to say, and to recognize that we are so honored and so privileged that he trusted us enough to let us continue publishing what is basically his journal to a large extent. I'm also particularly grateful to all those who made this transition possible, and particularly here at ICCT, particularly grateful to the editorial team and to the communications team. Perspectives on Terrorism is, I think a lot of you, if not all of you, would agree, a leading academic journal, and also a great resource for students, for researchers, for practitioners, and for policymakers active in the field of counterterrorism or countering violent extremism. We at ICCT, together with ISCA and CSTPV, we want to build on and to expand the journal's existing reputation. We want to further professionalize the editorial experience for the reviewers, but also for the readers and for the authors. We want to modernize the journal's design and accessibility online, all of that while maintaining Perspectives on Terrorism as an open access journal, which is truly at the heart and part of its identity. And you might already have seen a large part of it if you have already visited the new website of Perspectives on Terrorism. And if you haven't, I strongly encourage you to visit the new journal at pt.icct.nl. I think you might already see some images of what the journal and the PDF of the journal now look like, and we would strongly encourage you again to browse the website, to browse the new issue, to discover all of that by yourself. At the moment, it is still, I should say, not a full version of the website that you will be able to see online, as basically we're still migrating all the archives of the journal that you can still access from the website of Leiden University, but in a very short while, you'll be able to access all the issues in one place on the new website of Perspectives on Terrorism. And there's also a number of new features, some of which basically were already existing under the journal in the PDF, but some of which would be newer, that we have transitioned to an online environment, such as basically a calendar of events relevant to the field of terrorism studies, bibliographies that have long been part of the identity of this journal, but also a number of other online resources that are particularly helpful for, again, researchers, practitioners, and policymakers, for instance, such as databases. And there's quite a lot of databases out there on terrorism and counterterrorism. So all of that is quite exciting and will be accessible in a short while. For all of us at ICCT, this is really truly an achievement. We're really proud to be able to now publish this leading journal, again, in partnership with such a great team. As a matter of fact, this truly reflects the core mission of ICCT, which is to produce and contribute to cutting-edge research, but also to bridge between different communities, and notably between researchers, practitioners, and policymakers in the field of counterterrorism and countering violent extremism, and also to act as a sort of knowledge hub, publicly accessible, compiling research, the best research on terrorism and counter-terrorism. We're particularly proud to partner in this initiative with ISCA at Leiden University and with CSTPV at the University of St. Andrews, which are basically two leading institutions in this field, and creating de facto sort of a hub of excellence in the field of terrorism studies through this sort of flagship product. But perhaps more initiatives could step out of this partnership. We have established a new editorial team that is of goes without saying, of exceptional quality, and which is basically represented on this panel, and I will introduce all of them in a short moment, as well as a new managing editor, Anna Maria Andreeva, who is also editor at ICCT and a researcher here. We're particularly proud to have brought together that team, and I should also highlight that this team of co-editors are being supported by an equally amazing team of associate editors and an editorial board who are all listed on the website, and you can have a look. And I should say that we're extremely grateful to all of them who have accepted to join the team, for some of them, or to continue supporting perspectives on terrorism for a number of them who were already part of the previous board or team of associate editors. And finally, I should say, because we also just released the new issue of Perspectives on Terrorism, please have a look. There is a number of articles that are extremely interesting in this new issue, including a special section on anti-government extremism that was edited by Tore Bjorgo at CIREX at University of Oslo, but also other research articles and research notes published by a number of prominent authors in this field. I am now very happy to give the floor to Alex P. Schmidt, to share some of his personal thoughts on the history of terrorism studies and the role the Perspectives on Terrorism played in that field. Also to acknowledge, again, the major role that Alex has played both in this field of terrorism studies and obviously as a founding figure of the journal, one of the three founding figures of the journal, Perspectives on Terrorism. Alex has obviously been a reference, a source of inspiration for a lot of us in this field, and so it is a great honor to work with him and to have him here. I don't think Alex needs a lot of introduction, but nonetheless, it is custom, so I will still do it. But Prof. Alex P. Schmidt is a distinguished fellow at the International Center for Counter-Terrorism and also the director of the Terrorism Research Initiative. He has been in the past professor at Leiden University and at Erasmus University in Rotterdam. And also he was the director of the Center for the Study of Terrorism and Political Violence, CSTPV, as well, and worked for UNODC, among many other things. Alex has, above all, published what I think could qualify as an entire library on his own of books and papers on terrorism, some of which we are very proudly hosting on ICCT's website, including the handbook on terrorism prevention and preparedness that you can find on ICCT's website, or his latest paper on defining terrorism. Alex, again, was a founding figure of Perspectives of Terrorism. He was editor-in-chief for many years and now remains, and we're very glad remains, as a co-editor of Perspectives on Terrorism. So, Alex, sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Thomas, for your kind words. It's a happy moment for me to pass over this journal to James Forrest, who has been my co-editor and colleague and friend for many years. In fact, I also wanted him to follow me up in St. Andrews when I left there in 2009. At that time, I was co-editor next to David Rappaport of Terrorism and Political Violence, one of the major commercial journals in the field. Our journal has its origin in 2007, 2008. One of my researchers at the Terrorism Prevention Branch of the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, where I was officer in charge, was Robert Wesley, and he and I came up with the idea, which he realized, because in the first 2 years he really took the lead and was the founding editor. And he also started the Terrorism Research Initiative, which was a charity, still exists in North Carolina, which was the parent organization, which then later passed on to ISCA at the University of Leiden, and now, as of today, to ICCT. The situation of terrorism research and of journals was quite different in Europe than in the United States until the Madrid bombings of 2004 and the London bombings of 2005. One thought that Europe was not that much affected. And therefore, it was difficult to start a research initiative here. We managed to bring together 16 institutes and over 100 scholars and create a network. Such networks are normal these days, but at that time, it was quite an effort to bring it together. The first issues of the journal were irregular. Sometimes we had 12 issues in 1 year, but thin ones. Sometimes in the year 2009, when I took over, only 2. I'd like to quote you 3 sentences from the mission statement as I formulated it then for the journal. And I quote, "The mission of the Terrorism Research Initiative and its journal is the promotion of 3 C's, coordination, cooperation, and collaboration amongst individuals conducting research and analysis on terrorism and related political violence. We at TRI," I wrote, "see Perspectives on Terrorism as a synergetic networking platform that serves the needs of the research and analytical communities. Our aim is to be practical, helpful, and useful to all those who subscribe to the mission of enhancing security through collaborative research." That was our mission statement. The journal's title refers to our conviction that truth is unlikely to be found in any single perspective, and that debate is the lifeblood of both academic scholarship and civil society. We try to be a low threshold journal. because we wanted to open it for young scholars who could not afford to pay the fees, sometimes thousands of dollars, that commercial journals now ask for the privilege of being published in them. In order to create such a network, we created national networks of PhD writers. Some of them functioned better than others. And we also issued, since 2013, an award for the best doctoral thesis in terrorism and counterterrorism studies. And that award has been going on, first every year, then every second year. And actually, you are just looking at one of the winners of this award. Thomas Renard got this award for the best thesis on counterterrorism in 2021. And if you look at the announcement section of the current issue of Perspectives on Terrorism, you see that a new round has been announced with a deadline of mid-May, and yesterday already received the first submission for this new round. So these are some of the things that we tried to do, and some other things did not succeed so well. But the award and the journal are two of the remaining and still blooming elements of Perspectives on Terrorism. We had always difficulties of finding funds because we could not pay the authors. We did not want to ask money from the readers. And while the costs were not high, maintaining a journal online is bringing some costs. Crowdfunding we tried, but was not very successful. If we look now at the field of terrorism studies as a whole, it is only one journal among 200 that are publishing regularly, and some cases mainly articles on terrorism. Most of them still paper-based. Ours was never paper-based. And in order to see what's going on in this field, you have to monitor it. And we have for this purpose several scholars, including Dr. Judith Tinnes of the Leibniz Institute, who produces in every issue unique bibliographies. She already has, for instance, published the 7th on Daesh or ISIS. And this is something that no other journal in the field does. We also have a conference calendar, we have regular book reviews. So this sets this journal apart from others. And I'm sure that in this new format, it will increase its readership, which is already quite high, around 8,000. That might look not that high, but I remember when I had responsibility for the leading journal at that time, Perspectives on Terrorism, we actually had only 550 subscribers. 450 of them were university libraries, about 100 were individuals. So high were the prices that few people could afford it. That might have increased a little bit, but it's nowhere near the level of an electronic journal like Perspectives on Terrorism. And that has given us such a wide range in civil society, in the analytical community, and of course in academia. And we have always prided ourselves to be a low access journal, but still 3 out of 4 submissions we cannot publish because the quality is not enough. And for the remainder, we usually advise, revise, and rewrite, and then we manage to publish this. So the reviewers, the anonymous reviewers, have an enormous impact on the quality of the journal, improving what are promising articles and making them outstanding articles. And that is the work of the editors, associate editors, and the reviewers. And I'm sure that this cultivation of the reviewers will go on in the new format of the journal. I'm sure that James Forrest is observing that the quality will be the same and perhaps even be improved and broadened. So I wish him well. And for the first year, at least, I will accompany from the sidelines in keeping this journal at the level it is. And I thank Thomas for ICCT becoming the parent organization of Perspectives on Terrorism. Back to you, Thomas.
Thanks a lot, Alex, and again, we're so grateful to all the work you did, and indeed to trusting us to basically continue working and building on this great legacy of Perspectives on Terrorism. Now, I would like to turn to the panel, and before introducing the panelists and the discussion, maybe just a few house rules. There will be some time to ask questions to the panelists. If you have any question, please raise them in the Q&A space that you see at the bottom of your screen. Please do not use the chat function, but only the Q&A. That is what it is for. Stands for questions and answers. The answers will be provided orally by the panelists, and I'll monitor those questions and try to make sure that we address these. And also, I would like to highlight that Alex Schmidt will also be available to answer any question you might have. So you can ask questions to the panelists or to Alex Schmidt, and we will answer all of these questions at the same time towards the end of this webinar. So I am very pleased to be joined for this discussion on the state of terrorism studies by 4 distinguished speakers and also members of the editorial team of Perspectives on Terrorism. So with us today, we have Professor James Forrest, who is professor in the School of Criminology and Justice Studies at UMass Lowell in the United States, and also a distinguished fellow at ICCT, and the editor-in-chief, the new editor-in-chief, indeed succeeding Alex Schmidt, of Perspectives on Terrorism. He is notably the author of several books, including The Terrorism Lectures, a collection of materials for terrorism students, and Essentials of Counter-Terrorism. Also with us is Prof. Tim Wilson, who is senior lecturer at the University of St. Andrews and director of the Handa Center for the Study of Terrorism and Political Violence, known as CSTPV, and a new co-editor of Perspectives on Terrorism. He's a historian by training, and his latest book was or is Killing Strangers: How Political Violence Became Modern, which I highly recommend. Also with us is Greg Klein. Dr. Greg Klein is assistant professor at Leiden University, member of the Terrorism and Political Violence Research Group, and also a new co-editor of Perspectives on Terrorism. He's particularly versed in quantitative analysis and has published many articles on terrorism in various prominent journals and policy-oriented outlets. And last but not least, with us also Joanna Cook. Dr. Joanna Cook is Senior Project Manager at ICCT and co-editor of Perspectives on Terrorism. She's also an assistant professor of terrorism and political violence at Leiden University, and she is the author of many articles and books, including A Woman's Place, U.S. Counterterrorism Since 9/11, and most recently, The Rule is None but Allah, Islamist Approaches to Governance, which she co-edited with Shiraz Maher at King's College London. Now that I have quickly introduced my fellow panelists, let me then turn to the questions. And the way I will proceed is basically by asking questions to 2 of the panelists every time, giving them a chance in turn to answer these questions. And my first question is for James and Tim, for James Forrest and Tim Wilson. And maybe starting with you, James, if you allow, how, in your view, has the field of terrorism studies evolved since you started working in it? Basically, how, in your personal view, drawing on your personal experience, on some anecdotes, how has the field evolved? What are, in your view, the key achievements or the key progress that you have been able to see over the past years and decades?
Okay, thank you, Thomas. When I began in this field over a couple decades ago, much of the research was on terrorist group actions, specific threats, leaders, state sponsorship of terrorism, and most often within political science departments. Now there's a broad diversity of topics being studied. There's lots of new and useful data sets available on incidents, profiles of groups and individuals. The use of court records and building databases has been good to see. More people are studying terrorism from multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary perspectives, and there's more people worldwide doing it. New journals like Perspectives on Terrorism, in which to publish their research, has emerged. There's lots of new undergraduate and graduate courses and degree programs in this area in multiple countries, and even online, like at St. Andrews University and University of Massachusetts Lowell. These programs are increasingly found in disciplines outside of political science, sociology, military government studies, criminology. There's been an increase focused on the psychology that drives the deviant criminal behavior we call terrorism. And we have better conceptual clarity on the processes of radicalization towards violent extremism. There's been more focus on the intersections of crime and terrorism, leading to more nuanced insights about decision-making, enabling contexts, government responses, and so forth. There's been new research on the internal vulnerabilities of terrorist networks and how these vulnerabilities can inform counterterrorism strategies. There's freely available resources like the Harmony Documents database at the CTC at West Point or the Abbottabad Documents database, and these provide useful insights in these areas. There's been new research on the reasons why people disengage from terrorism. There's been new research on the roles of women in terrorist movements, as well as their involvement in disengagement efforts. There's been new research on the roles of others outside government in combating terrorism more effectively. Seems like many years ago, the focus and expectation was exclusively on how governments should defeat terrorism. But the new broader focus is especially important today, especially regarding domestic terrorist movements. Governments play an important role, but in partnership with communities. And finally, it seems to be more encouragement to place terrorism within a proper context of threats and security. There is not a terrorist around every corner. There's not a terrorist under your bed. There's a greater focus on public education and resilience, and also recognizing the need to resist overreacting to the threat of terrorism. So those are my initial observations. Let me turn it back over to you now, Thomas.
Thanks a lot, James. Maybe I'll ask you just a quick follow-up question based on what you just said. I mean, you've been teaching terrorism and counterterrorism for quite several years now, and you've even published indeed several volumes of these terrorism lectures. What would you say is the main difference between like how you were teaching terrorism many years ago and how you would be teaching it now in terms of approaches, topics? I mean, you've already touched upon some of these things, but I would be very curious, like in like how you teaching, basically, how has the evolution of our field impacted you?
Well, one of the things that personally I enjoy is the comparative analysis approach. So drawing on multiple case studies from different parts of the world, and teasing out some of the similarities and differences, whether it's examples of violent extremism in Israel, Palestinian territories, Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka, Spain, Northern Ireland, Colombia, so forth, and getting students to realize that this is a type of criminal deviant behavior that individuals across a broad walks of life and backgrounds have engaged in over the last multiple centuries, really. And getting them to get a historical perspective and also the global comparative perspective, I think, has been very helpful for them to realize that there's a lot of rich material to dive into now that helps understand this behavior.
Okay, thanks a lot, James. Tim, turning to you with the same question, what is your view on the evolution of the field of terrorism studies? I realize it's dangerous to ask a long view to the historian, but still, I will do that. So how has this field evolved from your point of view, from your perspective?
You're a brave man, Thomas. How long have you got? I mean, I should really open by I mean, stating my credentials do not measure up at all to those of James. As a long server in the field, I'm really a refugee from history who ended up at CSTPV and then inherited the crown as director in 2016. So, huge respect for predecessors, including Alex, who've sat in this chair before me. The reason I say that is I think one of the things that has changed, that obviously I welcome, is the greater role and awareness and sensitivity to the importance of history in studying terrorism and past experience generally. And in fairness to those of you who've been laboring in the vineyard of terrorism studies for decades, it's not all been their fault that history hasn't enjoyed a higher profile. Historians have, sometimes shown a kind of horrendous kind of hauteur and kind of condescension to the study of terrorism. Sir Michael Howard, the distinguished late historian of war at Oxford, I think famously said that terrorism studies was responsible for more bad books than any other subject, with the exception of sociology. That is not the tradition that I stand in at all, but it is worth saying there has been something of a void, I think, or there was a void when I sort of first began to get involved a little over a decade ago. And that it's very, very welcome to see that begin to change. David Rappaport's seminal article, 4 Waves of Rebel Terrorism, is a classic contribution. It's what I think of as a kind of checkpoint article. You can't travel that road of looking at past terrorism without passing through that checkpoint, so to speak. It's not the last words. 10 pages on the history of terrorism is not all there is to say at all. And so I think, one of the really encouraging signs has been a greater sensitivity to what historians can bring, including contextual insight, the sense in which political violence never stands totally apart from its own times. I think there have been times in terrorism studies in the more distant past where, perhaps because of urgent policy agendas, so on and so forth, there's been a sort of need for scholarship in a hurry. That's not to caricature the whole field as that, but at its worst, I think terrorism studies has been a little bit like kind of shoals of damselfish on the Great Barrier Reef. We swing to any tide that seems to be dominant, and it's really great to see sort of countercurrents, see the field begin to mature. I think the sheer persistence of the Islamist threat means that we're now beginning to see a sort of scholarship that has much more, to borrow a phrase from anthropology, much more thick description to it. I'm thinking of perhaps invidious to single out a few works, but Thomas Hegghammer's The Caravan, Jutta Clausen's Western Jihadism. These are serious pieces of historicized scholarship that really are deeply marinated in research over decades and observation. So I think there's a sort of for me, as someone who didn't know much about Islamist terrorism before I joined CSTPV, I think one can now turn to a shelf full of books that really help bring that phenomenon into perspective. So the final thing I'd just say is I think the field's become more mature and reflective. I think sort of work of Bart Sherman, Andrew Silker on sort of review articles of how is trying to capture a sort of overview of the field and how it's developing. Lisa Stamnitsky's wonderful sociology of how the field developed. These are really encouraging signs. So I guess I would end with a sort of, the historian's lament that golden ages are never golden ages when you're living through them. But in some ways, I think the last 10 years have been a golden age for terrorism studies.
Thanks a lot, Tim. And maybe, just to push you a bit on like the unique perspective than historians can bring. This obviously could be the beginning of a whole lecture, if not a series of lecture, obviously. But what would be, from your point of view, the key insights or like core added value that history has brought to this field? What key lessons have you been able to bring, not you personally, but history as a discipline to this field?
I try and keep it short and sharp. In any longer term historical perspective, terrorism is weird violence. It's weird violence because it's very impersonal violence, slaughtering typically. I think Alex's wonderful consensus definition about, terrorism victims are message generators is a wonderful starting point for a historical inquiry, because I don't think this goes back centuries and centuries and centuries. Yes, one can find some examples that bear some relationship with Sakari 2,000 years ago and so on. They exist, but as a kind of consistent and repetitive phenomenon, I think this belongs pretty much to the modern Asia of the last 200 years. It's connected with much broader processes of modernization. If we understand them, we might understand something about it. But killing people who've never done anything to you, that's weird.
Thanks a lot, Tim. Now for my second question, I'd like to turn to Joanna and Greg. And maybe starting with you, Joe, if you accept. In light of all the research that has been published in terrorism, and we've heard that increasing number of research published over the past few years on terrorism and counter-terrorism, is it your view that we understand now the phenomenon better? Why is that, or why isn't the case? And basically, what in your view has contributed most to the progress, the stagnation, or the decline in this field?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I this is a great panel to be a part of, and I'm so pleased to be able to sit alongside some of these key figures in the field. And I think Tim and James really opened with a really helpful overview of the field and where we sit. And, from their comments, we can see that the field really has expanded and strengthened. And I think we do understand terrorism quite a bit better. I was the 9/11 generation where we grew up and, saw 9/11 in the world unfolding there. And it was quite a unique phenomenon, particularly for that generation. And so we went from trying to understand where and how people would join terrorism to understanding better what types of people, under what circumstances, with what trajectory of factors might be more likely to do that. But we're certainly not quite there yet in fully understanding who will ultimately undergo terrorism, who will not. If you have 1,000 people with the same circumstances who ultimately won't be a terrorist. But I think I'm going to give just one example where I think we've really come to understand this a bit better based on some of the research I've been focused on for a decade now. But one of the areas we really understand better is the involvement of women and gendered aspects of terrorism. And, I think traditionally there was a view that women were not really involved in terrorism. They weren't necessarily always on the front lines. A lot of research that was published on women in relation to terrorism wasn't in the key terrorism journal or terrorism studies journals, or really being integrated or taken up by mainstream terrorism research. But we can't say this is the case anymore. And me and my colleague Deborah Margolin have just done a 50-year systematic review of literature on women in terrorism. That's a working paper right now, but we've just presented it at ISA. And we've identified and assessed 661 academic peer-reviewed publications on the topic of women in terrorism. We excluded almost 1,000 that didn't quite meet the criteria, but it just speaks to the amount of volume there. But some of the kind of findings that we had that I think really emphasize how we better know this and how we're focusing on it a lot more is that between 1970 and the year 2000, there were only 42 articles which discussed women in terrorism, and 619 since 2001 now. And the top 3 years for publications on women in terrorism have all been since 2018. The highest number of which was 2021 with 69 publications on the topic. So there was really a large uptake and an expansion of research in this field. But it's also speaking to some of the trends we've seen more traditionally in the field, where it's quite responsive. So we saw thousands of women go from around the world to join a group like ISIS. And a lot of the focus in this field has continued to be responsive and again, largely focused on ISIS. Speaking to some of I'm just going to highlight a couple more kind of key points from this, because I think it's really helpful to outline the state of the field and how this particular topic aligns with it. But, only 25% of the journal articles which discussed women in terrorism were actually in the top 9 terrorism studies journals. 72% of those pieces were single authored, so there wasn't a lot of collaboration in the space still. And there was still a large focus on this, particularly from Western European and North American scholars. Almost 76% of that research was authored by folks from North America and Western Europe, and 50% of it was focused on Islamists. So It does highlight a lot of focus and knowledge being developed in certain areas, but again, to the detriment of other areas. So just a couple kind of concluding points here. We are starting to look at women in more complex ways through a gendered lens that considers unique and shared drivers and pathways to extremism, the roles within the groups, gendered considerations within ideologies, and in areas like rehabilitation and reintegration. But this has also prompted us to start thinking more about gendered analysis more broadly. So considering things like men and masculinities vis-a-vis violent extremism, which I think is quite encouraging. And I know for a lot of my colleagues who focused a lot on areas like propaganda or some of the harder areas being studied in terrorism studies, there's also been a lot more focus on researcher mental health as well, which I think is quite important. So, whether it was colleagues like Elizabeth Pearson or Charlie Winter, who have all kind of presented research and publications on things like researcher safety, researcher mental health, and then people like James Khalil have offered guides to interviewing terrorists and how to do this in a much safer way as well. I think it's encouraging to see the kind of focus on those areas of terrorism research in particular.
Thanks. Thanks a lot, Joe. I mean, if I just follow up quickly with one quick question. In your view, this increased focus on women in terrorism, is that, and you kind of already alluded to that, but just want to push you a little bit further there. Does that reflect a reality, or at least a perception, that women are more involved in terrorism? Or does that reflect rather like a previous inability to recognize the role that women were playing in some of these terrorist organizations?
Like, I think a lot of it has been, you focus on the actors who take up the guns, you focus on the leadership. I mean, a lot of it is focused on the very, very hard end of these groups. And I think as we've become more progressive with trying to understand the broader environments in which these groups evolve, the broad network of actors that have some kind of affiliation with them, I mean, it has proven to be, I think, quite a useful environment to think about women in terrorism more. And then again, the very responsive nature of terrorism studies. Why did my neighbor in Canada or the UK or Spain all of a sudden decide to pick up and go join a terrorist group in Syria? So it became, I think, a lot more publicized and personal for a lot of individuals who might not have thought about this before too. So it is kind of two ways. So just a broader expansion of trying to understand these groups, actors, and networks a lot more effectively. But also the real response that we're dealing with in the face of ISIS and thousands of women from around the world mobilizing and joining this group. Thanks
a lot, Joe. Greg, turning to you now also with the same question. Do we understand terrorism better now? Why or why not?
Sure. Thanks, Thomas. And, first, thanks for being part of this panel. And I really look forward to representing Institute of Security Global Affairs as one of the co-editors for Perspectives on Terrorism in this transition. And I think the short answer to Thomas's question is yes, we understand more. I don't see how we couldn't, considering Brian Phillips' new article in Terrorism and Political Violence. Can I mention that journal here? He just wrote that we have about 6,000 new articles since 2001. So we must have learned something. We must understand something more. And so I think from my perspective as a political scientist, we've made some tremendous advances in understanding different strategies of terrorism, thinking about the effects of terrorist violence on voting behavior, different socioeconomic, political motivations for individuals supporting terrorist groups, and also how political institutions and different systems can create opportunities for terrorist groups and influence the level, the intensity, the frequency of terrorist attacks. But I do think that as a field, sometimes we walk this tightrope and have to balance with the political saliency of terrorism and the attention that large attacks get, and that new or extraordinary violent groups or movements kind of receive our attention. And sometimes research is driven towards trying to analyze these new and emerging threats and may risk losing track of or kind of pulling away from developing more overarching theories and kind of analyzing the implications of our theories. And part of this, again, is the saliency. Part of this is reflective of ICCT and think and do tanks. And and trying to make the research applicable to current events. But at times, I think that also limits some of the more scientific theory building and kind of higher level understanding of what's driving this violence and how it might be manipulating politics or manipulating different types of support. And so in thinking back to your question, Thomas, of course, again, that answer is yes. But I also think compared to many other research fields in political violence or armed conflict, our theory building endeavors or the theory building side of what we do has actually maybe slowed down a little bit as we've gotten further and further from 2001 and trying to understand what happened. Because as I think we develop less about the phenomenon as a whole, and a little bit becomes overshadowed of understanding or analyzing the new developments and evolutions and adaptations in terrorism, terrorist violence, and counterterrorism. And so I think what might really highlight where this kind of continued pursuit and balancing act between trying to analyze new events and staying very relevant to current events, which I don't think we can't be, given how salient this is and how much attention terrorist attacks receive, that we're really good again in analyzing and researching changes in tactics and new targets and propaganda and recruitment, radicalization processes, as my colleagues have pointed to today, and why individuals might join and act on these violent urges. But I think at a cross-sectional or that cross-national, cross-group level analysis or perspective that we can bring, I think we still struggle to identify when or why groups or movements begin using terrorism tactics or essentially become a terrorist group. And so we can understand how this violence looks and changes once it starts, but I think we still struggle to understand what kind of initiates a group to, especially political organizations, to start using these violent tactics rather than more traditional political tactics.
Thanks a lot, Greg. Maybe just a quick follow-up question for you as well. If you think back, so you say, well, there's been 6,000 articles since 2001, and a lot of these are focused on latest developments, trends, analysis of this, and not enough theoretical work. But still, I guess there must have been some. So I just wanted to push you a little bit on that. It's like, what are maybe one or two works theoretically driven that you think have contributed tremendously to this field over the past few years?
I think one of the ones that I think is essential to this, if we look at Kidd and Walter's 2006 book, Strategies of Terrorism, they lay out kind of 5 ways terrorist groups use violence, why they're using violence, and there's outbidding, there's provocation, attrition, and so what we think about with these groups is what that's then kind of developed or it pushed a whole almost subfield within in terrorism research, that there's been then evolving debates of if we think about strategies and that there's this rational application of terrorism or it's logical, then we must see it work at some point. Yet a lot of the research tells us that terrorism does not necessarily work as this political tactic, that you don't necessarily get the things that you're trying to bargain for. And so it's kind of developed this entire debate, and that's what I think when I'm talking more about kind of the higher arching theoretical debates, that if we can drive that there's these 5 rationales or 5 strategies of why groups will engage in terrorist tactics, we then start to unpack, is it successful, is it not successful, are there limitations to when these could be used, are we thinking about success in the right way of the ultimate political goal of if a group wants to separate from a state, will it achieve that separation? Or is there lower levels of the strategic acting when we think about trying to mobilize more support, recruitment, gain more resources, and essentially just trying to keep the movement alive? And so I think that's the type of debate that I think sometimes gets lost as researchers, as we try to kind of speak to the latest and current events and apply some research to explain what's going on. I think sometimes rather than sitting down and trying to process and understand at a higher kind of phenomenon or kind of theoretical level of thinking about why this violence might be occurring.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Greg. Maybe going back to a second round of question to the panelists before turning to the audience. So please continue shooting questions to the Q&A. Question for James and Tim again. So we've discussed a bit where this field is coming from, but maybe I'd like also to discuss with you what are the remaining gaps or limitation in the field of terrorism studies in terms of how it is structured, in terms of the influence of key stakeholders in it, or how priorities are being determined in terms of methodologies, in terms of disciplines that are prominent or not prominent enough in your view. So basically just asking a bit also where the field is going and whether it is going in the right direction, and if not, then can we still change course? So it is a very long question, and I still would like to give you up to 5 minutes to answer it, but James, turning to you first.
Okay, thanks, Thomas. As an optimist by nature, I think the field is generally heading in the right direction in terms of producing more data sets, empirical evidence for use for testing theories, expanding our understanding of terrorism and effective counterterrorism. It's, of course, great to see an international community of scholars engaged in the field of study. Applications to the degree programs that I mentioned in the field have remained strong. But that said, I think we may now be seeing a bit of attention exhaustion among the public and government leaders when it comes to anything terrorism or counterterrorism. When you combine that with the shift toward great power competition, this may impact availability of government funding for research in our field, for example. In terms of research topics, I think we still have a lot more work to do in terms of how and when to assess the effects of counterterrorism efforts, particularly in terms of what has successfully encouraged individuals to voluntarily disengage from terrorist activity, and what sort of reintegration policies or programs are needed. On a similar note, we need more research on the ways in which counterterrorism measures have affected communities, to include eroding civil liberties, exacerbating social tensions. There's a need for policy-relevant research on how to effectively mitigate the threat of far-right and far-left violent extremism before it gets worse. Some broad consensus on the definitions of the terms that we use in our research, particularly when coding our data. That'd be a huge benefit to the field. We also need new research on how new and emerging technologies might offer surprising and possibly deadly new opportunities for terrorist attacks, not just drones or artificial intelligence, with the rise of deep fakes and virtual realities, of course, but others that we may not have yet recognized as a potential threat. Finally, I was thinking, if I were to give advice to someone who's just now beginning their career in the field of terrorism and counterterrorism studies, I'd offer probably about 5 recommendations to start off with. First, try to read as much as you can about a variety of terrorism or counterterrorism related topics, including some that might not even seem relevant to you at first. You never know when that aha moment is going to lead to new promising research questions. Second, I encourage students and new researchers to try and study why people who are just like you in terms of beliefs, values, socio-demographic background, and so forth, have chosen to engage in terrorist violence. We need to continually confront the mistaken notion that it's only certain types of people, it's only them who engage in terrorism. Third, collaborate with others when you can, especially across disciplines and with practitioners. If possible, try to collaborate across national and cultural contexts as well. Fourth, on a somewhat related note, be open to different theories, explanations for what you may be finding in your research. Be willing to challenge your assumptions. And finally, we need to ensure the highest levels of integrity in this field. We should demand transparency, accountability, moral and ethical behavior of ourselves and each other, especially given the high potential for political bias in terrorism and counterterrorism research. So those are just some hopefully useful recommendations, and I turn it back to you, Thomas.
Thanks a lot, James. And indeed, these are excellent recommendations, I think, for for students and young scholars, but I would say also maybe for some established scholars. So definitely worth taking into account. Tim, turning to you with the same question indeed as well. Are we heading in the right direction? What are we doing well? Do we need to change of course?
Well, as a publisher's son and an academic, I can do no better than echo James's last point about read more. The only answer to the question, how much should I read? More. Also, read books that don't have terrorism in the title. Read more widely. I'd absolutely echo that. In terms of whether the field is going in the right direction, I think there has been enormous progress, and I think that continues, and I think will. I do take James's point about potential exhaustion of the policy community. And I think that is on my mind to some degree, because there is a lot still to do. I think, you know, Joe has powerfully highlighted the, you know, really just how recently the field has begun to sort of look at women in terrorism and counterterrorism in a serious way. There's so much more to be done. I do worry about global reach. You know, the terrorism studies is essentially a kind of, has its roots in the Anglophone academic world, North America, UK, and parts of Western Europe, where there's a lot of English speakers. Yeah, that's not where most of the terrorism is happening these days. So there's a kind of capacity issue, I think, around particularly Africa, which seems to be, you know, topping the charts for all the wrong reasons for in terms of intensity of terrorism. And, you know, terrorism, I think, in, you know, instances like Nigeria or whatever, it's very embedded in deeper insurgencies, so it's kind of not as clean cut. But I do think we need to sort of build capacity and not lose interest just because there seem to have been, thank goodness, you know, fewer attacks in North America and Western Europe. Having said that, we have built such a formidable kind of series of counter-terrorist policies and agencies across various governments. I think the momentum will continue for some time. So from that point of view, I'm broadly optimistic. I do think there's a bit of an empty sandwich, as I think of it. You know, we've got kind of great literatures on sort of, you know, IR, international relations, economics, political science, at the sort of macro level. We've got some very good literatures that tend to focus on the individuals, you know, sort of radicalization literature, psychology, criminology. When you open up your sandwich between those two, sort of mezzanine type analysis, particularly the kind of what James actually references, sort of comparative case studies, that sort of thing, that isn't trying to be global and isn't trying to be just the individual. Obviously history, but, you know, anthropology too. You know, it's a bit of a disappointing feeling. I think we could still do more there, but generally, like James, I am an optimist.
Thanks, thanks, Tim. We always need optimists around ourselves to feel to feel better. So you're great.
Optimism of the will, pessimism of the intellect, as Gramsci said.
All right. Joe and Greg, turning to you for a last question before opening up to questions from the audience. And Joe, maybe starting again with you, what are still the key knowledge gaps in your view, or key topics that require further research? What research topics should we prioritize right now?
Yeah, like I think we are a field that loves to do systematic reviews of our own field, which is a very helpful thing. And I think a lot of the thematic and knowledge gaps that have been highlighted historically still remain to differing extents. So again, right, there's been so much focus on jihadism for so many years now, but I think to the detriment of better understanding right-wing extremism, for example, or other areas like single issue terrorism, distinguishing links between online activity and offline action. The regional focus is a big one. There has been a lot of focus on the MENA region, but this has also come, I think, at the neglect of other areas, including Africa and Asia. There is more research coming up on that, but it has very, very much been dominated by that one specific region. And you know, there was an interesting review that's just come out by Moskalenko et al., and it highlighted several areas for growth opportunities, which I don't think have really come up. So I just want to give them a mention here. But thematically, they've highlighted areas such as the role of grievances and the role of emotions in radicalization and terrorism, which I think kind of also highlights some of the evolution in thinking in this field, or new areas to potentially pursue. And I know based on a lot of the work I've been doing recently, there's several areas I think really could use a lot more focus. And again, I've been focusing a lot on ISIS-affiliated families and doing a lot of work in Iraq as well. And better understanding how family networks are impacted by that affiliation to violent extremism, I think is very important. So not just, you know, really expanding from the risk of recruitment, which has often kind of framed the discussion, but really looking a lot more at how is the life of a child impacted when a family member is involved in violent extremism? How do you rehabilitate or reintegrate families that have that kind of stigma of being associated with a terrorist actor? You know, if the work in Iraq, for example, there's 30,000 individuals, women and children largely, that are currently having to be rehabilitated and reintegrated, but have not actually conducted any violent action, but are viewed as associated with ISIS. And there's been a lot of interesting work recently on rehabilitation and reintegration of terrorist actors in non-Western settings. So there's been more work recently on Al-Shabaab, for example, work in Boko Haram in Nigeria. But again, I don't think there's been a lot of comparison of how these rehabilitation programs have worked, what those reintegration programs, have succeeded in doing or where they've potentially been more limited. We see a lot of big changes in the world today too, and I'd love to continue to see terrorism research speaking a little bit more with these topics. Conspiracy theories, anti-government movements and protests, lessening faith in democratic systems, I think are very important for us to better understand and really integrate into how we think about terrorism research today too. But also being very clear about those lines and boundaries in our research. So what is legal and extreme thought versus what is illegal extreme action that could result in criminal activity. So being very clear about where our lines and boundaries in this field are too. And a couple other very quick ones, research on men and masculinities. We've seen a little bit more evolution in that space, which I think is interesting. Interdisciplinary research, which has been echoed. We've got a book coming out on rebel governance and how that also speaks to a lot of the focus on terrorism research as well. I think is a really interesting consideration. And assessments of tools and their use in the field, risk assessments, needs assessments, a lot, these are things that have been quite difficult for researchers to access, but they really do shape how individuals experience and go through terrorism-related processes, investigations, assessments, and so forth. And I think it's a really important area to consider. And as our world increasingly faces the prospect of AI, how do these new technologies, how can they enhance research in this field? What are the limitations around AI in the field of terrorism research? What are the dangers of it? And looking at terrorist actors themselves, what is the role of AI, or how could it be used to recruit, to radicalize, to facilitate attacks, and so forth? So, AI is coming up incredibly fast, and it's going to, I think, impact almost every area of our lives. And I think it is a really important one to really think about a little bit more holistically in the field from our perspective as researchers, but also via terrorist actors as well.
Thanks a lot, Joe. And a lot of these topics would make very good topics for articles to submit to Perspectives on Terrorism. Greg, turning to you with the same questions indeed. If you were to advise young researchers starting a PhD or people to submit to Perspectives on Terrorism, what should be topics of priority?
Sure. I think one topic of priority that I think is maybe not ready for submission to a journal yet, but would be something that a PhD student could endeavor. I think goes back to some of what Alex and James pointed out, an article in this journal in 2021, where one of the limitations in the field is just data availability. And I think this goes back a little bit to my comment before. If we try to understand where we see terrorism begin, or kind of if we can think about attacks, and especially in this kind of big data analytic world we live in, we still really kind of struggle to harness the power of data or predictive modeling to identify where attack threats come from, or what vectors we need to really worry about. And I think we have kind of two limitations, or I see two sources of limitations. One is just the nature of the game, and that's we need more data. We need better data, not just more data, but better data. We need to, as James had just said, kind of understand how we're coding this or defining different aspects, what we're trying to gather. Part of this too is that a lot of what we work in and what we're trying to understand, it's going to be very hard to collect information and data on this, especially on the counterterrorism side, because a lot of this is going to be going on kind of behind the scenes and is not public information. And so oftentimes when people study this, it's sometimes at a country level. And if we can abstract that more up to a regional or cross-national global level and try to get some improved data and measurements, especially of counterterrorism practices, I think we can improve some predictive modeling, get a better sense of where terrorism threats might be emerging, different locations we need to worry about, because we're really good at getting this in hotspots through predictive modeling or high terrorism countries. But outside of those, it's a little harder for these models, and we still struggle to get them to predict or try to forecast trends in violence or where we might be higher at risk. And I think second to that, and one where I do think that there's lots of room for publication, for students thinking, for PhD theses and dissertations. Oftentimes, I think we don't necessarily approach terrorism studies as a phenomenon in kind of the same socio-political format if we're thinking about it in terms of political violence or other types of armed conflict. And so I think if we can move terrorism or think about terrorism as a tactic of political violence, or even one form of political engagement that fits somewhere in a range of activities from protesting or boycotting to rebellion and civil war, I think we can improve our understanding of kind of how, why, and when terrorism emerges as a viable or a rational tactic. And so therefore, when groups might adopt or begin to engage in terrorism. And I think this is very evident in going back to, again, how current events and the saliency of terrorism and the threat drive a lot of what we do. As Joanna was just saying about conspiracy theories, anti-government sentiment and behavior, there's been some poking around and some exploration of how this might start to emerge in terms of eco-sabotage or environmental terrorism or climate change. And where right now we see a lot of the threat from protesters is kind of gluing themselves to things or less destructive type of activism. But at what point does that maybe start to tip into this more extreme type of violence and things that present maybe a wider violent threat to societies? So I think it's thinking about where do we see that crossover and what really drives maybe kind of more traditional or legitimate political action into where we cross into this terrorist violence and then this political extremism that I think we see lots of movements kind of on the cusp of today, but we're not quite sure of where that tipping point really is going to be or what's going to drive maybe the emergence or shift towards more violent tactics by some of these different groups and movements.
Thanks a lot, Greg. Thanks to all the panelists already to have answered this first round of questions from my side. And now I'm very happy to open up to questions from the audience. And I was looking at them right now, and there's quite a number of them already. Very interesting, very challenging questions as well. So I will take them in no particular order, but I think there is one here that I would like to start with. Several of you have mentioned that the field of terrorism studies was still quite Western-centric, and there is a question about this. How can the discipline move beyond a largely global North perspective or focus? How can we basically address what some of you have already identified as a challenge or a gap or a limitation in our field?
Yeah, sure. Answer that question. Back in the early 90s, I edited and co-authored a volume called Western Responses to Terrorism. And to my amazement, it took over a quarter of a century before somebody came up with the idea of non-Western responses to terrorism. That was actually Mike Boyle, a colleague of mine at St. Andrews, and I probably gave him the idea to the volume because he asked me also to write a foreword for it. But one of the amazing things of that volume is that the non-Western responses to terrorism are not much different from the Western responses. That might be explained partly by the colonial wars and the repression of colonial movements. But somehow the idea exists that non-Western Southern response is so much different to what comes out of the United States or Britain or some other nations here. I wish it were, but it isn't. May I add one more thing that has also not caught much attention, and that is the terrorism by states. Somehow the discussion today, like in many other places, is terrorism is a non-state act. But when I started studying terrorism and wrote a dissertation on intervention and counter-revolution in the Russian Civil War, I looked both at red terror and white terror. The whites were then the reactionary insurgents, and that has gone down. And now when you look at how wars are waged, including the war in the Ukraine, there is a lot of state terrorism there. And that certainly deserves more attention than it currently gets. So much from me.
Thanks a lot, Alex. Anyone else in the panel would like to take on that question? Yeah, great.
Thanks, Ruben. So actually, I'm working on a data collection project right now that builds a little bit from what Alex was saying, and we're trying to capture and collect information on counterterrorism globally, so including kind of the global South. And we are finding that counterterrorism looks quite similar on the surface between global North and global South countries, or at least how they implement it at the state level. And that might be driven by a lot of training and funding is coming from global North and Western European countries. And what we're really seeing is where the difference in counterterrorism practices so far seems to be linked more to the political institutions and regimes and to human rights practices. So how much these governments already kind of violate and repress their own people and their civilians, that seems to be driving how counterterrorism looks and the practices and behavior a little bit more than just a global North, global South divide. But how we integrate this more and more kind of into where we're seeing all the writing in terrorism studies. From my view, part of it, again, is a data limitation problem, and that in a lot of Western European, Western Northern countries, it's easier to collect the data. And so there's ways to analyze it that make it a little bit easier and cross-national that don't require necessarily as much country expertise as some Southern Hemisphere countries might require, because there's problems with collecting the data and being able to then analyze what is going on inside that country or cross-nationally.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Greg. And maybe just to add one aspect to that, I was going to say that also at Perspectives on Terrorism, we would very much welcome contributions basically addressing and basically taking this field outside of a Western-centric response, and also encouraging submissions by scholars, young or established, from other parts of the world. But that's just a side note. Tim, I see you unmuted yourself, so perhaps you wanted to jump in.
No, really just to sort of, as I've already perhaps indicated, that this is a big problem and something I think about a lot. I think capacity is a big issue. It's partly data availability. It's partly just some of the institutional hurdles to building links with universities in the global South, and actually sort of getting, really sort of creating that strength and depth. But, that will only begin to improve with the sort of sustained drive that Thomas has just indicated with the journal. It's not easy at all. We've just unveiled in St Andrews a Global History of Terrorism archive, which is an extraordinary collection of files that were going to go in a skip. We managed to save them. It's about sort of 1,700 bulging ring-binder files that sort of cover political violence and terrorism from about 1979 to sort of 1993. So it's kind of just pre the internet age. And it does try and cover the whole globe, but even that, I mean, it's a pre-internet age, and it's predominantly Western-centric media. But I think awareness is the first, in a sense of discomfort, and actually sort of actively trying to dismantle that. But it's going to be a long-term push.
Thanks a lot, Tim. Maybe let me focus on another question. Actually, there's a couple of questions, at least, if not more, that sort of were trying to take us a bit towards the rise, or at least the perceived rise, and that perhaps is up to discussion, of populist, far-right extremism, violent or more traditional. And I think basically, I guess, because if I want to group two questions together, I would say part of the question is, are we seeing a rise in this form of extremism? And the other part of the question is, if there is in the background, particularly, I guess, in the West, in North America, in Europe, if there is indeed in the background a rise in right-wing populist, radical nationalist far-right parties, in the background, how is that potentially affecting or field also in terms of doing research, in terms of basically ethical questions that researchers need to think about when engaging in doing research on these groups? I assume I'm trying to interpret the questions a bit as well here a bit, but doing research on these groups, if indeed that ideology or that narrative is becoming more mainstreaming also in traditional political discourse. So 2 questions there, and just opening up to the panel again.
I don't mind taking it, Thomas, if that's all right.
Sure.
Briefly, don't want to hog the discussion. Yeah, I think you put your finger on what is a key issue, which is the rise of the electoral far right, sort of co-driven or competing with the rise of sort of violent extreme right, if I can use those labels. I mean, the historian in me says that, the most powerful witnesses against sort of fascism were those who experienced it, and they're dying out. There's not going to be many more of them. So that sort of immunity that a lot of Western politics has had for decades is clearly on the wane. And I think, one of our chief barriers is essentially naivety. I think you've seen that with the Shawcross Prevent Review in the UK, which, really, to my mind, massively underestimates the problem of extreme right violence, particularly its potential for shifting the so-called Overton window. In other words, the range of acceptable policy issues far to the right that, plenty of people might online, I'm speculating admittedly, but might online look at, say, the kind of horrendous murders in Christchurch and say, well, I don't agree with what he did, but he must have been very provoked to have done something like that. That sort of sense in which the sense of acceptable policy options gets shifted to the right is, frankly terrifying. And speaking just for the UK, there is a real reluctance, I think, certainly in current policy government circles, to call a spade a spade. The murder of an MP during the Brexit campaign, was dismissed as not being terrorism. That's just kind of absurd. So, I think we need to be just much more honest about that.
Yeah.
So the final point really being that, that extreme right violence is part of the Western political canon. We've had the luxury of forgetting that for a few decades, but its potential is there and it's coming back.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Anyone else? Jebs, I mean, maybe like in the US, obviously you've been going through a few years also of witnessing probably more research on these topics under also a particular administration under Donald Trump, I guess. So you have probably been asking some of these questions to yourself or some of your colleagues.
I don't know what you're talking about. Yeah, so we've got we've got some issues to deal with, certainly in our context. It definitely drives home one of the ways in which we teach about terrorism to undergraduates and graduate students is the notion that it's a contextually oriented behavior, terrorism, regardless of the ideology that's motivating it or the grievances behind the behavior. It's a type of behavior that we see in multiple different kind of contexts. And by looking at it in that way, we start to realize that you have to have a contextually appropriate counterterrorism response. And right now, I think the U.S., at least I hope, again, as an optimist, that we're moving in the right direction. We now have a national strategy for combating domestic violent extremism in the U.S. It's a first for the U.S. So, just like an alcoholic, the first step is recognizing that you have a problem. This is certainly something that's a good sign in the right direction here in the U.S. The other thing that I was just kind of reflecting on in terms of the context in which we've seen the increased focus and attention and activities related to far-right extremism here in the U.S., I think we have to do a much better job in terms of holding politicians accountable. For, again, like Tim said, not calling a spade, refusing to acknowledge that, for example, in 2017, an attack against a mosque was an act of terrorism. We had a particular political leadership in our country that refused to acknowledge that as an act of terrorism, which, most of us in the field would say, well, of course it is. So I think we have to hold our leaders accountable for those kind of mistakes.
Yeah, thanks a lot, James. Joe, we have a couple of questions that maybe are not explicitly directed to you, but I think you're perhaps that is your field of research that relate to women in terrorism. And so I will bring those two questions together, and then if anyone else on the panel feel also they want to answer that, please feel free. But there is a question about what is motivating women to join terrorism and what can be done to stop it. But also there is another question which I also think is quite interesting. Basically, are there parallels or key differences in the way basically women engage in terrorism in the West as opposed to in other regions in Africa, for instance?
Yeah, thanks for the questions. And it's nice to know that there's a bit more focus on this. I remember when I first started looking at the topic around 2013, I mean, I was asking about women that were going to join Islamic State, and, I would pose this question, and I would pose it at conferences that generally get kind of laughed out, like what roles do women have, or why are, what are you even talking about women joining this? But I think one thing that's quite important to know is that the motivations for women to join groups are often very much the same as men's motivations to join groups. But what that gendered analysis helps us better understand in terms of the motivations and the pathways and the circumstances under which they join violent extremist groups, it helps bring a much more nuanced lens to it. So there's not one reason why women join these groups. There's not one pathway, but understanding how men and women experience push and pull factors in relation to certain groups, the ideology they're adhering to, and the kind of prescribed roles for men and women within those. Women have played roles in terrorist groups throughout history. You just have to look at the German Red Army faction, where women were the leadership of these groups too. So I think it really emphasizes that you really have to look at this on a contextual basis, including things like the regional norms in which these men and women are joining these groups, the ideology that these groups adhere to, and the kind of the very personal life circumstances under which individuals might join. Are they joining through family networks? Are they joining on a personal individual basis? Are they joining because they feel there's no other political recourse to address their grievances? So I'm afraid it's not a very simple answer, but what I think is very useful in terms of where we sit in the field currently is that I think there's a much more open, people are much more open, researchers are much more open to engage gendered analysis to help better describe and explain why men and women, boys and girls become associated with different types of political violence, and how that can inform things like the rehabilitation and reintegration responses as well. And in terms of the comparative component, there has been a lot of comparative work done. And so actually that's one of the points that we look at in the paper. So how much just looks at a single group and how much looks comparatively at several groups. But a lot of that tends to be quite descriptive as well. So describing how roles in different groups might be similar for women. So it does exist, but I think there are limitations in how far that research has gone, and I think there's a lot of room for more exploration there as well.
Thanks a lot, Joe. And maybe I'll throw a very last question. We have 3 minutes left, but still we'll attempt that very dangerous exercise. And there's a couple of questions that gravitate around the same theme, which has been touched upon by some of you in your first round of answers to my questions, which is basically that we might be entering a new age of global power competition. And then basically a question is terrorism becoming yesterday's thing? So are we becoming, from the cool kids, are we becoming a bit of the outcast? And basically, does that also, how does that influence our field? And then Alex Schmidt already mentioned, indeed, state terrorism, state-sponsored terrorism. Are we heading more in that direction again? Have we never moved away from that direction? So just anyone, a few thoughts on that particular aspect briefly, and then I think we will end after that round.
Since you mentioned my name, I think the shift of international political science attention to state actors, to the competition, China, USA, and the role of Russia, that does not mean that terrorism goes on the back burner. We have seen it in the Cold War. There were proxy wars fought in developing countries. And terrorism and its plausible denial is an instrument used by state actors. And in that sense, terrorism studies will not disappear because of the increased focus on big power rivalry. Maybe the funding will go down for some terrorism institutes, but the terrorism itself will remain.
Thanks a lot. Alex, Joe, you wanted to intervene as well?
Yeah, I can maybe just add a quick point, but I think, what the field of terrorism studies has really helped me reflect on is how we can better interact with and speak to adjacent fields. So with the Prepare project, I've been thinking so much, we look at children involved in families with links to violent extremism, and it's really highlighted for me how, whether it's children that grow up in cults or gangs or trafficking, children exposed to war, there's so many other adjacent fields that we really haven't had a chance to have a real in-depth conversation with. And I think in a slower period like this, which is a great thing, it's great that we don't have attacks rolling across Europe and North America and other areas in the world right now as we have in the past. And I think it's a real opportunity right now to consolidate knowledge in terms of what we have learned over the past decades, and also, again, really think about where we sit a little bit more in relation to adjacent fields as well, and how we can work a little bit more closely with those and take the knowledge that we have in our field and have a bit more of a conversation with, again, those partners in other closely linked fields.
Yeah. Thank you, Joe. Unless anyone feels a burning urge to add something in light of time, I suggest to close here. And I would like to thank again a lot all the fellow panelists and including Alex Schmidt for having shared your thoughts and knowledge with us today. I would like also to welcome you all as part of the new Perspectives on Terrorism family under the leadership of James Forrest as the new editor-in-chief. We're very glad, and also still under the close watch and support of Alex Schmidt as co-editor. So we're looking forward to a new exciting adventure. So please, everyone, visit the new website of the journal, pt.icct.nl. Subscribe to make sure that you receive every time the latest issue. Please submit your articles as well. There is a nice, very loud submit button under submissions on the website. We're welcoming submissions from young scholars as well as established scholars from any regions of the world on all topics related to terrorism, counterterrorism, violent extremism, and countering violent extremism. So please share your manuscripts with us. Also tell your colleagues to do the same. We would be more than happy to consider these for publications. As Alex mentioned, there's also an announcement for the PhD award. So if you recently defended your PhD, or if you know someone who defended his or her PhD recently, please share that announcement with them so that they can be considered for the PhD award. And thank you everyone in the audience for attending, participating. We try to reflect your questions, so apologies for those who asked questions that we didn't have time to answer, but it was great to have you all with us for this discussion. And as a closing, I will simply share this thought with you. I realized yesterday that there is only a few letters difference between a webinar and a wine bar. I don't think this is really a coincidence, so you know where to find me next. And on this note, thank you very much, and looking forward to receive your manuscripts in the near future. Everyone, thank you very much, and have a nice